Okay, let's be real for a sec. You're probably juggling a million things right now. Am I right?
Probably.
But you're also here because, like me, you're kind of fascinated by the idea of getting more done, without feeling totally overwhelmed.
Mm,
And that's where Eat That Frog by Brian Tracy comes in.
yeah.
It's a classic of the productivity world, and today we're going deep beyond just the usual summary stuff.
Right.
So if you're ready to tackle those tasks you've been putting off, the ones that feel like, eating a live frog, stick with us.
Definitely. What really makes this book stand out, I think, is it's not just about like tips and tricks.
Oh yeah, it's deeper than that.
It goes into the psychology of why we procrastinate in the first place, and then it gives you this framework for tackling those frogs, as Tracy calls them, those things we tend to avoid.
Okay, I'm intrigued. But seriously, why frogs?
Well, it's a metaphor, of course, but think about it. Starting your day by just tackling the biggest, most daunting task on your list.
Like actually eating a live frog.
Exactly. And Tracy's whole point is once you've done that, everything else, it just feels easier.
So it's about momentum, right?
Totally. Yeah. Momentum and overcoming that initial resistance. It's like once you con off a frog, you're unstoppable.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture. But we're not just diving into the book itself today, are we?
No, no, we're not. We've also got a great summary from the Book Lab YouTube channel to give us another perspective.
I love that. Always helps to see things from different angles. So before we really get into the meat of it, can you give us a quick overview of who Brian Tracy is?
Yeah, so Tracy's been kind of a leading figure in self-development for decades, really. I mean, he's written so many books and given so many speeches.
Like a ton.
A ton, yeah. On all these topics like time management, leadership, goal setting, you name it. He's a productivity guru.
So not just some random guy with an opinion.
Right, exactly. He's got some serious experience behind him. And Eat That Frog is considered one of his most impactful books.
With techniques that have helped people like actually improve their productivity and stuff.
Yeah, a lot of people.
Okay, you've convinced me. Let's dive in. What's the core message? What's the big takeaway here?
The main idea is this. By deliberately choosing to tackle that most important task first, the one you're most likely to procrastinate on, you set yourself up for a much more productive, fulfilling day.
It's like take control before it controls you.
Yes, being proactive, not reactive. And to do that, Tracy gives you all these practical techniques and strategies.
Okay, let's hear them. What are some of the key concepts that really stood out to you?
Well, one that really resonated with me was the 80-20 principle, but applied to procrastination.
Right, the 80-20 principle.
You know, the idea that 20% of our efforts produce 80% of our results.
Yeah, focus on the vital few, not the trivial many, right? But how does that apply to procrastination?
So Tracy argues that most people end up procrastinating on the most important 20% of their tasks,
Oh, wow.
the ones that would actually make the biggest difference.
So we're like putting off the stuff that would have the biggest impact.
Yeah,
That's eye-opening.
it is. And that's why identifying and tackling those frogs is crucial. But it's not just about blindly jumping into the hardest task either. Tracy really emphasizes planning and prioritizing.
Oh, yeah, having a clear plan. That makes a big difference. What does he suggest for planning?
He's big on wayly planning, not just like scheduling appointments, but actually thinking through what needs to be done and in what order. And that's where his famous ABCDE method comes in.
Ooh, a method. I love a good method. Tell me about this ABCDE thing.
So it's basically a system for prioritizing tasks based on their consequences. A tasks, those are the most important. The ones with serious consequences if you don't do them. Those are your frogs.
Okay, A for absolutely must do. Got it. What about the rest of the alphabet?
Okay, so lead tasks are less important. They're kind of like the tadpoles, as he calls them.
Tadpole.
Yeah, and then you've got C tasks, which are nice to do but no real consequences. D tasks you can delegate to someone else. And then E tasks, which you can just eliminate completely.
Wow, so it's not just about doing things, it's about strategically focusing on what truly matters.
That's it. And he says, never work on a B task when there's an A task left undone. Don't let those tadpoles distract you from the main course.
I love that analogy. It's so easy to get caught up in the smaller, less important stuff, but we got to remember what really matters. We've got planning, prioritizing, but what about when everything feels important?
Right.
How do we choose which frog to eat first?
Well, Tracy's got a point. He says there's never enough time for everything, but there's always enough time for the most important thing. He calls this the law of forced efficiency.
So being ruthless with our priorities, focusing on the tasks with the biggest impact.
Exactly. And get this, he even suggests that like 10 to 12 minutes of planning can save you 2 hours of wasted time throughout the day.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a pretty compelling argument for taking a few minutes to plan each day.
I think so. Yeah, that's the thing, right? Even with a good plan, even with the best intentions, those frogs can still feel really overwhelming.
Oh, you're telling me I think we've all been there, staring at a tab that feels like climbing Mount Everest. What
Hmm.
does Tracy suggest we actually do to tackle those big, intimidating frogs?
He's got a few practical techniques. One that I found really helpful is the salami slice method.
Salami slice. Okay.
Yeah, it's basically about breaking down a large task into smaller, more manageable pieces.
So instead of trying to eat the whole frog in one bite,
Right.
you slice it up.
Exactly. You slice it up and take it one bite at a time.
Makes sense. And as you complete each slice, you get a little sense of accomplishment,
You do.
and that motivates you to keep going.
Yeah, it's like those video games where you level up after you complete a series of smaller quests.
Oh, yeah.
It keeps you engaged and moving forward.
I like that. And then there's the Swiss cheese method,
Yes, the Swiss cheese method.
which is about working on a task for a short, dedicated period of time, even just 5 or 10 minutes.
Yep, it's like punching a hole in a block of Swiss cheese.
Okay, I like that visual. It seems less daunting to make a small dent in a task than to try and conquer the whole thing at once.
Right. And you know what's interesting is that completing tasks, even small ones, actually releases endorphins in the brain.
Wait, so we get a natural high from checking things off our to-do list?
Yes, you do. It's a real thing.
That's amazing. And this is where it gets really interesting. Tracy suggests that we can actually become addicted to this feeling of accomplishment.
He does. He says it's totally possible.
So the more we get done, the more we want to get done.
Exactly. It's like this positive feedback loop.
That's cool. But of course, motivation isn't always as simple as, chasing endorphin rushes. We all have those days when we just don't feel like doing anything, especially those frog tasks.
Oh, absolutely. Sometimes those frogs look more like fire-breathing dragons.
Exactly. What does Tracy say about staying motivated when you just want to hit the snooze button on everything?
Well, he really emphasizes that motivation is an inside job. It's not about waiting for inspiration to strike. It's about consciously cultivating a positive and proactive mindset.
So it's about taking control of our mental state. But how do we actually do that? Does he have any tips for that?
He has tons. One that I found really powerful is the idea of repeating positive affirmations. He suggests phrases like, I like myself and I can do it.
I'll admit that sounds a little cheesy at first. But I have heard that affirmations can actually be really effective. Is there any science behind that?
There is absolutely. Tracy points out that 95% of our emotions are determined by how we talk to ourselves. So if we want to feel motivated and energized, we need to pay attention to the messages we're sending ourselves.
It's like we're constantly narrating our own lives.
Arr.
And if we're telling ourselves that we can't do something or that we're not good enough, well, then we're kind of setting ourselves up for failure.
Yeah, and on the flip side, if we're feeding ourselves these positive, empowering messages, we're more likely to believe in ourselves and take action.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all of these pieces fit together. It's not just about the techniques themselves. It's about cultivating the right mindset to support those techniques.
Yeah, that's a great point. And speaking of mindset, Tracy also emphasizes the importance of maximizing our personal powers.
Personal powers, what are those?
He's talking about our physical and mental energy. We can't expect to be productive if we're running on fumes.
That makes total sense. What are some of his recommendations for keeping our energy levels high?
Well, he suggests paying attention to our natural energy cycles, and identifying those times of day when we're most alert and focused.
Oh, like those peak performances windows we hear about.
Exactly. And then scheduling, our most challenging tasks during those times.
So it's about working with our natural rhythms rather than fighting against them.
Exactly. He also talks about, the importance of getting enough sleep, eating healthy foods, and taking regular breaks.
It's funny how those basic self-care practices often get overlooked when we're, so focused on productivity. But they're absolutely essential.
They are. And you know what? Tracy actually recommends taking one full day off each week.
A whole day.
A whole day, yeah, for complete rejuvenation.
That seems almost radical in our always-on culture.
It does, but he argues that it actually makes us more productive in the long run. It's about preventing burnout and coming back to our work with renewed energy and focus.
Okay, I'm starting to warm up to the idea of a full day off, especially if it means I can tackle those frogs with more vigor the rest of the week.
Exactly. Speaking of frogs, let's circle back to those tasks that feel too big or complex to handle, What about those times when even slicing and dicing doesn't seem like enough?
Yeah, some tasks are just inherently monstrous. What does Tracy suggest for those situations?
He talks about the importance of creating large chunks of time for focused work.
Large chunks of time? Okay.
Yeah, this is especially important for those tasks that require deep concentration and can't be done in short bursts.
So it's about blocking off a few hours in your calendar and just dedicating that time solely to that one task.
Exactly. And to make the most of those focused work sessions, he recommends having everything you need at hand before you begin. It's like setting up your workspace like a surgeon prepares for an operation.
I like that analogy. It really emphasizes the importance of, You're being prepared and minimizing distractions.
Exactly. And once you're in that focused work mode, he suggests developing a sense of urgency in your work. It's about cultivating that internal drive to get things done quickly and efficiently.
So it's not just about blocking off the time, it's about really making the most of that time.
Right. And he even recommends repeating the phrase, do it now, do it now, do it now to yourself whenever you feel procrastination creeping in.
Do it now, do it now, do it now.
Yeah, it's like a mental call to action.
I can see how that would be helpful to snap yourself out of a procrastination spiral. But what about those times when distractions inevitably arise? You've got your chunk of time, you're ready to go, but then life happens.
That's where his concept of single handling comes in. It's about focusing on one task at a time until it's 100% complete without diversion or distraction.
That sounds like a tall order in today's world of constant notifications and interruptions.
It is challenging, but Tracy argues that it's one of the most important keys to high performance and maximum personal productivity. He actually estimates that starting and stopping repeatedly can increase the time required to complete a task by as much as 500%.
Wow, 500%. That's huge. That really makes you realize how much time we waste by constantly switching between tasks.
Yeah, it's like trying to drive a car while constantly hitting the brakes. You'll never get to your destination efficiently that way.
So single handling is about finding that flow state where we're fully immersed in the task at hand.
Right, and to stay in that flow state, he recommends repeating the phrase, back to work, back to work, back to work.
Whenever you feel tempted to get sidetracked,
Back to work, back to work, back to work.
another mental nudge to stay focused.
I like it. And while all these techniques and strategies are incredibly helpful, it's important to remember that not every technique will work for every person or every situation.
Oh, for sure. We all have different work styles and preferences, right? So how do we know what will work for us?
Well, Tracy encourages us to experiment and find what he calls our own personal productivity system. The key is to be deliberate and intentional about how we manage our time and energy. It's not about becoming a slave to a rigid system. It's about developing those conscious habits that support our goals and priorities.
So it's about finding what works best for us and adapting these principles to our own unique needs and circumstances.
Exactly. And speaking of goals, Tracy reminds us that achieving any significant goal requires certain levels of self-discipline. He defines self-discipline as the ability to make yourself do what you should do when you should do it, whether you feel like it or not.
Wow, that's a powerful definition. It really highlights the importance of being able to push ourselves beyond our comfort zones.
It does. And he believes that self-discipline is a muscle that can be strengthened through practice.
So the more we consistently do those things that are hard but important,
Right.
the easier it becomes to overcome procrastination and achieve our goals.
That's the idea. But what about those times when we're just feeling overwhelmed by the sheer number of things we need to do? Even with all these techniques, it can still feel pretty daunting.
You're right. Sometimes that to-do list feels like it's a mile long. What does Tracy say about managing that feeling of overwhelm?
That's where his concept of taking it one oil barrel at a time comes in. He uses this analogy of crossing the Sahara Desert, where the only way to make it across is to focus on reaching the next oil barrel, which is placed 5 kilometers apart.
5 kilometers.
Yeah. So instead of focusing on the vastness of the desert, you focus on the next achievable milestone.
You break it down one step at a time.
Exactly. It's about breaking down those overwhelming goals into smaller, more achievable steps. And just like crossing the desert, as long as you keep moving forward one step at a time, you'll eventually reach your destination.
That's a really encouraging way to look at it. It reminds us that even the biggest goals are achievable if we just break them down into those smaller steps.
They are, and as you make progress, you gain momentum and confidence, which makes it even easier to keep going.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into Eat That Frog, from planning and prioritizing to cultivating the right mindset and maximizing our energy. But before we wrap up part 2, can you give us a quick recap of some of the key takeaways that we can apply right away?
Absolutely. One of the most important takeaways is to develop that sense of urgency in everything you do. Make it a habit to move quickly on those key tasks. Become known as someone who gets things done efficiently.
So it's about being proactive and taking action instead of letting tasks just pile up.
Right. Tracy even recommends setting deadlines and sub-deadlines for yourself, even if they're not externally imposed. It's about creating a sense of accountability and pushing yourself to perform at your best.
That's a great tip. I think we could all benefit from a little more self-imposed accountability.
Another key takeaway is to focus on those key result areas that are most important for your work. Identify the few things that, if done well, will make a real difference, and prioritize those above all else.
So remembering the 80-20 principle and focusing our energy where it matters most.
Exactly. Don't get bogged down in the trivial many of those tasks that take up time but don't contribute much value.
And finally, remember to take care of yourself. Make sure you're getting enough sleep, eating healthy foods, and taking those regular breaks to recharge.
Yeah, you can't perform at your best if you're running on empty.
Great points. So we've covered a lot of ground in part 2 of this deep dive into Eat That Frog. We've explored practical techniques for tackling those daunting tasks, cultivating a proactive mindset, and maximizing our personal energy. But there's still more to come in part 3.
Indeed. We'll be synthesizing everything we've learned and offering some final actionable takeaways to help you conquer procrastination and make the most of your precious time.
So stay tuned, you won't want to miss it. Welcome back. We've been on this journey exploring Brian Tracy's Eat That Frog.
So much good stuff in this book.
It really is, and all this wisdom about like boosting productivity and stuff. But you know what's really hit home for me? It's all about mindset. It's not just having the right tools, it's having the right mindset to use them.
Totally. And Tracy really makes a point of saying this isn't about becoming like a productivity machine, right? It's about intention.
Intention.
Being intentional with your time and energy so you can focus on what matters.
Okay, so before we wrap up, let's distill this down. If someone could only take away a few things, like the most potent takeaways from Eat That Frog, what would they be?
All right. Well, I'd say it starts with clarity. You have to know what you want, like really know.
Both personally and professionally.
Exactly. And Tracy's point about goals that aren't written down, they're just wishes. They don't have the power of a real objective.
So step 1, get those goals out of your head and up to paper. Make them real.
Yep.
But then what? I mean, we've got the clarity, but now we're staring at this mountain of tasks.
Right. Which is why ruthless prioritization is key. Remember the 80-20 principle, the ABCDE method. It's about doing the right things, not everything.
Fighting those high-impact frogs and not getting sidetracked by the tadpoles. But that's easier said than done, right?
For sure. Which is why Tracy is so big on action, like becoming a doer, someone who doesn't just plan but executes. His little do it now, do it now, do it now thing.
How cheesy.
Yeah, but there's power in it.
It's like a little kick in the pants and you feel procrastination setting in. But we got to remember the inner game too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Positive self-talk.
Like we talked about before.
We become what we think about, so feed yourself empowering messages. Those affirmations, they might sound silly, but they work.
They can rewire our brains for success.
They can.
And, we can't forget about self-care. It's easy to get burned out when you're trying to be super productive.
It is, and that's why I love Tracy's point about taking a full day off each week, just to rejuvenate.
A whole day.
A whole day. It's not about being lazy. It's about being strategic.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
You can't pour from an empty cup, right?
Right. Okay, so we've got clarity, prioritization, action, the right mindset, taking care of ourselves. Lots to digest here. But there's one thing I want to circle back to before we go.
Okay.
Creative procrastination.
Oh, yes. Putting off the less important stuff on purpose, it really challenges how we think about busy sometimes.
Which leads me to a question for our listener. What are you going to procrastinate on today?
Ooh, good one.
What can you push aside to make space for those frogs that actually matter?
Something to think about. What are you holding on to that isn't really serving you?
Great question. And that's it for our deep dive into Eat That Frog. Hopefully you've gotten some great insights.
And that you're ready to tackle those tasks with a little more energy and focus.
Remember, it's not about perfection.
It's about progress, one frog at a time.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, happy frog eating.